There's a quiet moment every spring that always catches me off guard, right when the last stubborn patches of frost have melted and the ground underfoot finally feels soft again. You step outside with your coffee still warm in your hand, breathe in that unmistakable earthy scent rising from the beds, and then you crouch down to touch the soil. It's different after winter, duller, tighter, almost sleepy. In my own small plot here in the temperate zone, I've seen it happen year after year. The rich loam that felt like chocolate cake in autumn now sits compact and pale, as though the cold has drawn the life right out of it. Yet that very moment is when the garden whispers its loudest invitation. A little patient work with compost, and the whole space begins to wake up, green and generous once more. I've come to think of those first warm weeks as the garden's gentle reckoning. Winter doesn't just pause the plants, it changes the very ground they grow in. In the northern United States, where heavy snows pile up from December through March, the repeated freeze and thaw cycles push soil particles together until the structure collapses. Over in the cooler corners of Europe, think the damp clay soils of southern England or the heavier loams around northern Germany. The same thing happens, only the rain keeps falling long after the snow has gone. Moisture saturates everything, washing soluble nutrients deeper than roots can reach and leaving the top layer starved. Beneficial microbes slow to a near standstill when soil temperatures hover around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The worms burrow down and wait. What's left behind is a bed that drains poorly in one spot, crusts over in another, and feels strangely lifeless when you squeeze a handful. I remember chatting with a neighbor last March whose raised beds in upstate New York had turned almost concrete hard after a brutal ice storm. Her kale seedlings from the year before had struggled, and she swore the slugs had never been worse. It wasn't bad luck, it was the soil crying out for renewal. If you skip that renewal, the consequences creep in quietly at first, seeds germinate slowly or not at all. Young roots hit a wall of compacted earth and circle back on themselves instead of plunging deep. Leaves emerge pale, thin, almost translucent, because the nutrients they need are locked away or simply gone. Pests and diseases find easy footholds in weakened plants, and before you know it, the harvest is modest at best. I've watched it play out in community allotments across the Midwest and in small cottage gardens tucked behind stone walls in rural France. The difference between a bountiful summer and a disappointing one often starts right here, in how we treat the soil when spring finally arrives. That's where compost steps in like an old, trusted friend. At its heart, compost is simply the garden's own recycling program. Kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, spent flower stalks, grass clippings, all transformed by time, moisture, and invisible armies of microbes into something dark, crumbly, and sweet-smelling. It's not magic, though it feels like it when you spread it. A good finished compost carries a balanced mix of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, along with trace minerals that chemical fertilizers can only dream of matching. More importantly, it rebuilds the soil's physical architecture. Tiny air pockets open up so roots can breathe and water can move without drowning anything. The organic matter acts like a sponge, holding moisture during dry spells, yet releasing it slowly so nothing ever stays waterlogged. And perhaps, best of all, it wakes up the living soil. Billions of bacteria, fungi, and earthworms come back to work, breaking down nutrients into forms plants can actually use and creating that wonderful, resilient web that keeps a garden healthy for years. You don't need a soil test to know when your beds are asking for help. Your senses will tell you everything. Walk the rows after a light rain and notice if puddles linger too long or if the surface forms a hard, shiny crust that cracks like old paint. Scoop up a handful. If it feels gritty and falls apart instantly or packs into a tight, unyielding brick, the balance is off. Look at the color. Healthy spring soil should carry the deep, chocolate hue of well-aged leaf mold. If it's faded to a dusty gray or pale tan, nutrients have leached away. Young seedlings that sit still for weeks instead of stretching toward the sun, or established perennials whose lower leaves yellow and drop early, are sending the same message. Even the absence of life is a clue. No earthworm castings on the surface, no tiny fungal threads visible when you gently part the mulch. These signs appear everywhere, from the short growing seasons of Scandinavia to the variable springs of the Pacific Northwest. Once you learn to read them, the garden starts speaking clearly. Of course, compost is a star, but it rarely works alone. I like to gather a small revival team that works in harmony with whatever climate I'm gardening in. Well-rotted leaf mold or a thick blanket of organic mulch, straw, shredded bark, or even pine needles in acidic-loving areas protects the surface from temperature swings and keeps precious moisture from evaporating on those bright April days. in heavier clay soils common across parts of the American South or the Low Countries of Europe. I reach for coconut coir or rice hulls to lighten things up without changing the pH too dramatically. Aged manure from local farms adds a stronger nutrient punch, but only after it's fully composted so it won't burn tender roots. And for an extra boost of microbial life, especially when starting new beds or reviving neglected ones, a sprinkling of worm castings feels like giving the soil a shot of espresso. The beauty is you don't need to buy everything at once. Start with what you already have. Last autumn's leaves raked into a corner, the contents of your winter compost bin, and build from there. Putting it all together is simpler than most folks imagine, and far more forgiving than the glossy magazines suggest. I begin by clearing away the obvious debris, spent stalks, matted leaves that never quite broke down, and any weeds that managed to overwinter. No need for deep digging, that only disturbs the soil life we're trying to encourage. A light forking or broad forking of the top 4 to 6 inches loosens things just enough for air and water to penetrate. Then comes the compost, about an inch or two across the entire surface, spread as evenly as you might frost a cake. I work it gently into the top layer with a rake or the back of a hoe, never turning the soil over completely. A final blanket of mulch 2 or 3 inches thick seals everything in like a cozy quilt. A gentle watering follows, not a soaking flood, just enough to settle the materials and signal to the microbes that it's time to wake up. Within days, you'll notice the difference. The surface stays moist but not soggy. Earthworms begin to tunnel upward and the whole bed seems to soften and darken. How much is enough? That's the question I hear most often from newer gardeners, especially those working small urban plots or balcony containers. The answer is refreshingly modest. For most vegetable beds, I aim for a light, even layer, no thicker than 2 inches so the soil can breathe. In raised beds, common across the UK and the northeastern states, I mix 1 part finished compost with 2 or 3 parts existing soil when refreshing the top 6 inches. Container gardeners on city balconies or sunny terraces in Mediterranean Europe can blend up to 30% compost into fresh potting mix, but never more. Too much and drainage suffers. If your soil has been neglected for seasons, you can go a bit heavier the first year, then taper off as the living system takes over. The golden rule I've learned over many springs is this: feed the soil a little and often rather than dumping everything at once. Nature rewards patience. Along the way, it's easy to stumble into a few well-meaning mistakes that set the whole process back. I've done most of them myself. Spreading half-finished compost still warm to the touch is the most common culprit. Those active microbes can rob nitrogen from the soil as they finish their work, leaving plants hungry. Piling it on too thickly creates a soggy mat that invites rot and slugs. Forgetting the mulch layer is another quiet error. Sun and wind steal moisture faster than you expect, especially in the variable springs of Central Europe. Turning the soil too aggressively with a shovel destroys the delicate fungal networks that have been patiently rebuilding all winter. And perhaps the biggest oversight of all is focusing only on feeding the plants while ignoring the living foundation beneath them. I once helped a friend in rural Oregon who had been pouring liquid fertilizers onto her tomatoes every week yet wondered why her yields kept shrinking. We spent one morning simply rebuilding the soil, and the difference by midsummer was night and day. There are gentle ways to multiply the benefits of that first spring refresh. Layering compost with a living mulch of low-growing clover or vetch in paths between beds keeps the soil covered and feeds the microbes even after you've planted. Rotating crops from one season to the next, moving nightshades away from where brassicas grew last year, prevents nutrient depletion and breaks pest cycles. Leaving beds planted with cover crops through winter, or at least scattered with quick germinating buckwheat or phacelia in early spring, ensures the ground is never naked for long. A simple compost tea, brewed from a handful of finished compost steeped in rainwater for a day or two, can give seedlings an extra microbial boost when watered in at planting time. And learning to water deeply but infrequently encourages roots to chase moisture downward into the newly enriched layers. These small habits turn a single spring effort into a garden that grows stronger with every passing year. The beauty of this approach is how well it suits almost every kind of home garden I've encountered. In a traditional vegetable plot growing tomatoes, beans, and squash, the compost-rich soil supports heavy feeders without exhaustion. Raised beds, so popular from the Pacific Northwest to the allotments of suburban London, drain beautifully once amended and warm up faster in spring. Balcony containers and window boxes that once dried out overnight now hold steady moisture, letting herbs and salad greens thrive even in the heart of a city. Flower borders filled with cottage garden favorites, Foxgloves, delphiniums, and old roses bloom more generously when the soil stays alive and crumbly. Even homestead-scale gardens with chickens, fruit trees, and perennial beds benefit. The same compost pile that feeds the vegetables can top-dress the orchard or refresh the strawberry patch. No matter the size or style, the principle remains. Healthy soil grows healthy everything else. Timing matters more than many realize, and it shifts gently with your local climate. Across much of the United States, the sweet spot arrives when soil temperatures climb above 50 degrees and the last hard frost has passed, usually late March in the south, mid-April farther north. In Europe, the window opens a touch earlier in milder maritime zones like the British Isles or coastal France, but continental gardeners in Poland or the Czech Republic often wait until early May when the ground has truly thawed. The key is to watch the earth itself rather than the calendar. Once the surface has lost its winter chill and earthworms are active again, it's time. I like to finish the work a week or two before sowing or transplanting so the microbes have a chance to settle in. If you're running late, even a quick surface dressing after planting still helps. The garden is remarkably forgiving. In the end, every spadeful of compost we spread is an act of faith in the quiet intelligence of the soil. It reminds us that a garden isn't just rows of pretty plants or baskets of produce. It's a living partnership between sun, rain, roots, and the unseen world beneath our feet. When we care for that partnership after winter's long rest, the rewards stretch far beyond this season. Tomatoes taste sweeter, roses bloom longer, and the whole space hums with the gentle industry of pollinators and beneficial insects. The work itself becomes a kind of meditation. Hands in the earth, the scent of warm compost rising, the satisfaction of knowing you've given the garden exactly what it needs to flourish. So, if your own beds are just beginning to stir this spring, I hope you'll join me in giving them that gentle awakening. Start with one small corner if the whole garden feels overwhelming. Rake on a layer of compost, tuck it under a blanket of mulch, and watch what happens. Week by week, you'll see the color deepen, the texture loosen, the plants reach higher. Before long, you'll find yourself standing in the same spot where the soil once felt tired and lifeless, now surrounded by lush growth and the soft buzz of life returning. That's the quiet miracle we gardeners get to witness every year. The soil remembers, and with a little help from us, it gives back more than we could ever ask.